BMW, like so many other manufacturers, loves a niche, and for every normal car it has in its range, it tends to have a more dynamically styled alternative. And that brings us to this. It's the new iX2, and it's a more coupe styled version of the regular iX1. Underneath, we've got a full electric platform. Inside, we've got an innovative interior with loads of cool features, which I think you're going to find really interesting. And it's all wrapped in a rather interesting design. So without further ado, shall we jump in and see just what the iX2 has to offer? As I mentioned, the iX2 has been designed with a kind of coupe influence, which is why you'll see that heavily raked roofline leading into that quite sharp boot. But there are some other cool features to talk about elsewhere, such as the really thin headlights and the massive kidney grille, which is actually surrounded by an LED light, and that looks really interesting at night. Overall, it's a very exciting design, and one that I do think will get people talking. What I like about the interior of the iX2 is that it offers a good blend of technology but with practical features. So up front we've got this really widescreen setup which blends your main infotainment and your driver controls ahead of you. The main screen has been cleared up. BMW have put some new software into it, and it's now a little bit more intuitive than it was before. When this generation of screen first came out, it felt quite busy, and though there aren't any physical controls down the bottom, there's no rotary dial or iDrive, the simplification of the menus means that you can get through it pretty simply. You also get wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and to be honest, I use that most of all. So that's one click away and I'm straight into Apple CarPlay. That's a very useful feature. But aside from that, we've got a handy storage area underneath, which is rubberized, so it stops all of those items from sliding around. And there's also a really cool slot down here for the wireless phone charging. And all you need to do, just drop your phone, and it keeps it secure, and it'll also remind you if you've left it in there when you stop the car to get out. It'll give you a little notification. 2 deep cup holders and 2 USB-C charging points. It's just a very user-friendly experience that you get from here, and even though the steering wheel is a little bit chunky for my taste, I actually like the general ambience in here, and it's helped no end by a panoramic sunroof which helps it all feel a little bit lighter. Obviously, with such a raked roofline, the iX2 is going to have something of a compromise when it comes to headroom. Now, I'm not even that tall, I'm just under 6 foot, and you can see my head is grazing the roof. So if you are quite tall, you're going to feel pretty snug back here. But for shorter adults or for kids, and there are ISOFIX points on either side of the seats, then I think it's going to be okay. Also, because of the electric platform underneath, we are getting a nice flat floor. So if you are sitting in the middle, you've got a little bit of extra space compared with a traditional petrol or diesel car, though it's still not completely roomy. That said, I've got loads of room for my knees and for my feet, so you can get comfortable even if that headroom is a little bit impeded. In terms of practicality, we've got some nice big nets ahead of us and some deep door bins down the side for water bottles. And because we've got 2 USB-C charging points, you shouldn't have too many arguments about who gets to charge up their devices. It's a nicely finished cabin, but I feel that that roofline is just compromising things a little too much. At 525 litres, the boot space that you get from the iX2 is actually quite respectable, and it's around about the same that you'll get from an Audi Q4 e-tron. There's also not too much of a penalty in switching between the iX1 to the iX2 in terms of boot space. However, and as I keep mentioning, that sloping roofline means that the entry point to the boot is different to the iX1, and you won't be able to get items that are as tall in this car as you would with the iX1 instead. So I would say that if you're after load lugging capability above all else, then the iX1 is the one to go for. But this is still a very usable space, and thankfully enough, there's a separate area underneath for storing the charging cables, so they're all out of sight and they're kept tidy. As I mentioned, very usable, but if you do want to put those taller items in more occasionally, then the iX1 might be a better choice. This particular iX2 that we're driving today is the more powerful eDrive 30 model, and it's got xDrive, so all-wheel drive traction, and electric motors that are producing 301 brake horsepower. So it's actually quite punchy in terms of output. You also get 494 Newton meters of torque, and that equates to a 0 to 60 miles an hour time of 5.4 seconds, which I think is more than reasonable. Now, as with most electric cars, the instant delivery of torque makes the iX2 feel very zippy away from the line, and certainly more eager to get going than a conventional petrol or diesel car of the same kind of output. But let's talk about range. Now, BMW claims that you could get up to 266 miles of range from a full charge in this iX2. I think that's a little bit punchy. I've been seeing around about 250 from a full charge in warm weather, and that's going to drop down to about 220, 230 when it gets chilly. I think 260, 270 might be something of a distant realm in terms of range figures. But what is this car like to drive? Well, it all feels quite BMW-like, if I'm allowed to say that. There's some nice weight to the steering, the car feels very flat and composed through corners, and it manages its power delivery decently when you're going through the bends as well. Though I must say that when you step on it, it does feel a little bit like old school torque steer as the front wheels try and struggle to contain everything, and it just feels a little bit grabby. That's the only way I can describe it. Also, being an M Sport, the ride does feel somewhat firmer than a conventional hatchback or smaller estate car, and I have found that you get jostled quite a lot when you are travelling, particularly on country roads like these. You just feel a little bit tossed about in your seat, and it just doesn't feel quite as relaxed as you'd kind of want a car like this to be. That's my biggest criticism of how this car drives. It just feels simply too firm. I just like it to be a bit more comfortable and a little less edgy. This isn't an M performance car after all, this is just an M Sport car. And I think that because it's not a full fat, high performance EV, something out of the M range, then I just like it to be a little bit more comfortable. I don't think that's a lot to ask, really. As you might have noticed, you do get some space-agey sounds accompanying the acceleration when you step on the throttle in the iX2, and that's something that we've seen applied across the BMW range. Lots of Hans Zimmeriness noises coming through. I don't mind it too much. You can switch it off if you'd like to, but I don't find it too intrusive. And on this car there is a slight increase in engagement because there's this left-hand paddle which you might be able to see, and that puts you in boost mode. So for a short period of time, 10 seconds, you get maximum attack, maximum throttle, and it's quite useful for overtakes though. I've only used it a handful of times during my time with the car, more out of interest than anything, because as standard it's got more than enough acceleration really. I would like more control over the regen. I feel like since EVs often leave you to feel a little bit detached from the whole driving experience, having regen paddles just gives you some form of interaction with it, being able to increase the regeneration or release it off, and I just like a bit more of that from this car. It's sometimes quite useful to be able to have control of it when you're coming up to a corner, or if you're navigating some country roads and you want to feel like you're slightly more in charge of the car than you would be otherwise, then regen paddles are a really good way of doing it. But this car doesn't have them, and I'd quite like to see that. There is a dedicated B mode which you use on the gear selector to the left hand side, and once activated that increases the amount of regenerative braking that you're getting. So when you lift off the throttle, it does start to slow itself down. It's not all that aggressive, and it's certainly not as aggressive as I've seen on other electric cars where you feel like you've really mashed the brakes once you let off the throttle. But it is useful to have, and you can use it when you're around town or if you're driving on smaller roads, and then you can switch it off when you're on the motorway and you want the car to be able to roll freely to get the best possible efficiency. One thing I will say with this coupe-like design is that rearward visibility is very compromised. The rear glass is almost letterbox in size, and that means that when you are looking to the back, you just don't get as clear a view as you do from a regular SUV or even the iX1. Another downside is that you don't get a rear wiper, and this is a trend that I'm seeing across the EV landscape. There are loads of vehicles, cars like the EV6, a really popular car from Kia, that just don't have a rear wiper. And when it is raining, and let's be honest, in the UK it's nearly always raining, it's nice to be able to clear your rear wiper, particularly if you've been sitting in traffic and the natural air of the car can't do anything to wipe away the beads of water. Just have a little windscreen wiper. I really would just rather that. It's so much more useful. But then again, this is a car that's designed around its design. It's meant to look slightly different, and that does mean not having that useful function of a rear wiper, and it's something that I still find quite important and a feature that I'd rather have. It doesn't feel like the BMW iX2 is a niche too far. I like the way it looks, and I like its interior too, and it's got loads of practicality focused features which I think that will enable this car to slot into day-to-day life relatively easily. It's got a good amount of range too, and the connected services that it offers bring another extra feature to what is already quite a decent car. I do think, however, that some of the limitations brought on by the styling make this a more difficult car to recommend, namely that rear seat headroom and the access to the boot. But of course, If those are key priorities to you, then I'd always advise going for the BMW iX1. However, if you're after a car where styling takes the priority and you like to make a bit of an entrance, then the iX2 could well be worth considering. Thank you for watching this Motors new car review on the BMW iX2. Now, if you have enjoyed this video, please leave us a like below and let us know in the comments section what you think of the iX2. Do you like this coupe, different style type of thing, or would you rather something more traditional? And since you're here, please remember to subscribe to the Motors YouTube channel, and if you hit that bell icon, each time we upload a new video, you'll get a notification directly to your inbox.